As we gently settle into the quiet of the evening, let us begin a journey across time, across landscapes of desert and mountain, and across the imagination of cultures long past. Tonight, in this calm unfolding of history, we immerse ourselves in the story of Zhang Qian of China, a figure whose footsteps on dusty paths helped to lay the groundwork for what would later become the Silk Road. His life, marked by travel, diplomacy, and persistence, weaves together with the broader currents of Chinese history and the vast networks of exchange that shaped Eurasia. It is a tale both expansive and intimate, expansive in its reach across empires and centuries, and intimate in the human persistence of one envoy, enduring hardship and uncertainty for the sake of vision. When we speak of the Silk Road, we imagine caravans moving through sweeping deserts, traders resting in shaded courtyards, and the subtle mingling of languages, spices, and stories at crossroads. Yet before the Silk Road took form as the vast system of exchange that we now recall, it was an idea in motion, sparked by the daring of individuals. Among these, Zhang Qian stands at the forefront. Sent as a diplomatic envoy under the reign of Emperor Wu of the Han Dynasty, Zhang Qian carried with him not only the official seals of imperial China, but also the possibility of connection, an idea that China could engage with distant lands, that knowledge and goods might flow beyond the confines of familiar borders. The Han Dynasty, under Emperor Wu, was a time of ambition and expansion. Stretching from 1141 to 87 BCE, his reign was marked by military campaigns, the extension of the Chinese frontier, and an eagerness to strengthen the empire's standing among its neighbors. But there were also threats, most notably from the Xiongnu, a confederation of nomadic peoples to the north and west whose raids and mobility challenged Han security. For Emperor Wu, finding allies against the Xiongnu was a pressing concern. He dreamed of an alliance with the Yuezhi, another nomadic group once displaced by the Xiongnu who had moved far westward. Yet contact with the Yuezhi required more than speculation. It required a messenger willing to cross hostile lands, to risk capture, and to persevere through distance and uncertainty. That messenger was Zhang Qian. Born in Hanzhong, a mountainous region of central China, Zhang Qian was said to have been skilled, observant, and loyal. Chosen as an envoy, he set forth with a small retinue, carrying the weight of imperial hopes. His path, however, was not smooth. Captured by the Xiongnu early in his journey, he spent years in captivity. It was a test of endurance, of patience stretched across long seasons. Yet in time he escaped, and his determination carried him westward, into unfamiliar territories, toward the lands of the Yuezhi. Although his mission to secure an alliance did not succeed, the Yuezhi, having settled in fertile lands of Central Asia, were reluctant to engage in conflict. His journey brought back something else: knowledge. Knowledge of distant peoples, of fertile valleys and bustling towns, of horses of remarkable strength, and of the varied customs of Central Asia. Zhang Qian returned to China not only as a failed diplomat, but as a bearer of vision. His reports described lands previously unknown to the Chinese court, lands that offered not only potential allies, but also potential exchanges of goods, of crops, of animals, of culture. Emperor Wu recognized the significance of these revelations. Though the hoped-for military alliance did not materialize, the possibilities of trade and diplomacy began to stir the imagination of the court. In this way, Zhang Qian's journey became a seed, small but potent. From his footsteps across deserts and mountains grew the first branches of a network that would, over centuries, become the Silk Road. The name itself would be coined much later by 19th century historians, but the roots, the exchanges, and the quiet yet transformative power of commerce and culture began in these early contacts. Through the Silk Road, silk and porcelain from China reached the Mediterranean, while glassware, horses, spices, and ideas flowed eastward. Religions traveled too, Buddhism moving into China, Islam later finding its way into Central Asia. It was not a single road, but many, interwoven like threads in fabric, converging and diverging across vast distances. To follow Zhang Qian's story is to follow a thread back to the origins of this tapestry. His life allows us to see how history can pivot on the endurance of one envoy, and how the pursuit of alliances against nomadic raiders could unexpectedly open doors to a larger world. But his story is not only about politics or military strategy. It is also about landscapes. about what it meant to walk through deserts where the sky stretched unbroken, to cross mountains where snow lingered, and to encounter faces speaking unfamiliar tongues, carrying goods never before seen in China. As we drift through these centuries tonight, we will move gently through the stages of this story. We will begin with the Han Dynasty itself, its setting, and its ambitions. We will trace Zhang Qian's first mission, his captivity, his escape, and his eventual return. We will linger in the details of the lands he saw, the fertile Fergana Valley, the Central Asian oases, the peoples whose customs he described. We will explore how his journey influenced Emperor Wu's policies and how the idea of long-distance trade began to crystallize. From there, we will watch the unfolding of the Silk Road over the centuries, the goods that traveled along it, and the cultural exchanges that it nourished. Finally, we will reflect on Zhang Qian's enduring legacy, remembered not as a conqueror or a king, but as a traveler whose endurance and curiosity helped change the shape of history. Let your mind settle gently on the cadence of this tale. It is a story told not in urgency, but in calm observation, like the quiet recounting of distant journeys by firelight. The deserts may seem vast, the mountains imposing, but through Zhang Qian's eyes, they become part of a larger journey, part of the weaving of a world that stretches beyond what is known. Tonight, we walk alongside him, softly, step by step, across history's great landscape. The story of Zhang Qian cannot be understood without first appreciating the broader canvas upon which it unfolds, the dawn of the Han Dynasty. To imagine China at this time is to picture a realm consolidating its strength after the turbulence of the preceding Qin dynasty, which, though short-lived, had set in motion patterns of centralized rule, imperial bureaucracy, and monumental ambition. When the Han emerged in 206 BCE under Liu Bang, known to history as Emperor Gaozu, it was as both a continuation and a correction of Qin centralization. Over the decades, the Han Dynasty developed into one of the most enduring and influential dynasties in Chinese history, lasting for over 4 centuries and shaping the cultural, political, and intellectual traditions of East Asia for millennia. By the 2nd century BCE, when Zhang Qian was born, Han China was already a flourishing empire with expansive goals. Its capital, Chang'an, located near today's Xi'an, was a bustling hub of administration and culture. Wide avenues cut through the city, lined with markets that brought together artisans, farmers, and merchants. The palace complex stood as a symbol of imperial power, echoing with the deliberations of court officials and scholars. In the countryside, the rhythms of agricultural life, plowing fields, planting millet and rice, tending silkworms for the production of silk, formed the bedrock of the economy. The empire was bound together by roads, canals, and systems of taxation and law, overseen by an increasingly sophisticated bureaucracy. Yet the empire was not at ease. To the north and west stretched the vast grasslands, the domain of the Xiongnu, a powerful confederation of nomadic tribes. The Xiongnu were skilled horsemen, adept at swift raids, and for decades they had been both a thorn in China's side and an unignorable presence on its borders. Their mobility contrasted with the settled agricultural life of the Han, creating friction and insecurity. At times, treaties were signed, marriage alliances forged between Han princesses and Xiongnu chieftains, tribute sent in the form of silk and grain. But these agreements were fragile. Raids and conflict often resumed, leaving border communities vulnerable and imperial pride bruised. Emperor Wu, who reigned from 141 to 87 BCE, came to power with an energy that matched the magnitude of the challenges before him. Unlike his more cautious predecessors, Emperor Wu was determined not merely to manage the empire's borders, but to expand them. His reign would come to be remembered as one of consolidation, reform, and outward-looking ambition. He strengthened the role of Confucianism in state ideology, reformed the bureaucracy, and encouraged scholarship, creating a cultural and intellectual foundation that would endure. At the same time, he invested in military campaigns to secure and extend Han influence, pushing into the Korean peninsula, into the south toward Vietnam, and into the western regions beyond the familiar frontier. It was within this atmosphere of ambition and anxiety that the seeds of the Silk Road were first planted. The Han were eager for allies who could help counter the Xiongnu threat. To the west, Emperor Wu heard of the Yuezhi, a nomadic group who had once been defeated and driven far from their homelands by the Xiongnu. Now resettled in the fertile regions of Central Asia, the Yuezhi were said to remain resentful of their old enemies. To Emperor Wu, they seemed like the perfect partners for an alliance. Yet the lands they occupied lay far beyond the reach of familiar Chinese roots. To contact them required venturing through the very territories controlled by the Xiongnu, an endeavor that few would dare to undertake. Still, Emperor Wu understood that the possibilities were worth the risk. If the Yuezhi could be persuaded to ally with Han China, a pincer movement might weaken the Xiongnu and bring long-desired security to the empire's frontiers. Moreover, contact with these distant peoples promised something more than military advantage. It hinted at new lands, new goods, and new opportunities for exchange. What silk was to the Han, horses were to the peoples of the West, animals of extraordinary strength, well suited to the rigors of cavalry warfare. Stories circulated at the Han court about these heavenly horses, tall and powerful creatures that sweated blood in battle. To acquire them was to acquire not only strength, but also prestige. As we picture this setting, let us imagine the Han court, its officials clad in robes of silk, debating policies under the weight of history and ambition. Scrolls of bamboo and silk bore records of past treaties and campaigns. The emperor's gaze extended not only over the granaries and armories of his empire, but also outward, toward lands that lay beyond deserts and mountains. For the scholars and ministers of his court, the idea of reaching distant allies was not a casual speculation, but a question of survival and strategy. Yet for the common people of the empire, the horizon was much closer. The fields they tilled, the markets where they sold their wares, the seasonal festivals where families gathered beneath lanterns and stars. These daily lives formed the pulse of Han China, steady and enduring, even as imperial visions stretched toward the unknown. This tension between the settled rhythms of agricultural life and the restless ambitions of empire defines the backdrop of Zhang Qian's story. He was not born into an ordinary time, nor was he chosen for an ordinary mission. His journey would become a bridge between these two worlds. The intimate familiarity of Chinese life and the vast, untapped possibilities of lands far away. Before he ever set foot beyond the frontier, the forces shaping his mission were already in motion. The dynasty's hunger for stability, its emperor's hunger for greatness, and its people's quiet endurance beneath both. As we let this setting settle in our minds, we may picture it like the opening scene of a long scroll painting. At one end, the fields of the Han heartland, dotted with farmhouses and rivers. At the center, the grandeur of Chang'an, its markets filled with silks, lacquerware, and bronze. And at the far horizon, indistinct but beckoning, the lands beyond, the deserts, mountains, and grasslands where other peoples lived, traded, and dreamed. Zhang Qian's journey will carry us into those horizons. But before we walk alongside him, we pause here at the dawn of the Han Dynasty, in the steady rhythm of its life and the quiet stirrings of its ambitions. As the Han Dynasty found its footing in power and prestige, the figure at the heart of its vision was Emperor Wu, or Wu Di, the martial emperor. His reign from 141 to 87 BCE was not simply one of consolidation. It was a time of purposeful expansion, both of territory and of imagination. To understand Zhang Qian's mission, we must linger for a time in the halls of Emperor Wu's court, for it is here that the spark of this extraordinary journey was first kindled. Emperor Wu was born Liu Che, the great-grandson of the dynasty's founder, and came to the throne at the tender age of 16. Unlike his more cautious predecessors, he had little patience for compromise with the Xiongnu. He looked westward, not with resignation, but with desire. Desire for allies, desire for resources, and desire for prestige. He was not content with the boundaries inherited from his ancestors. He dreamed of pushing those boundaries outward into lands whose wealth was spoken of in whispers and whose peoples might bolster the Han's security. The empire, by the mid-2nd century BCE, was thriving in ways both visible and subtle. Fields produced grain in abundance. Workshops in the capital produced fine bronzes, lacquerware, and textiles. But beneath this prosperity, the threat of the Xiongnu loomed like a shadow. Their raids disrupted border regions, drained resources, and threatened the stability of communities. The Han court's earlier strategy of appeasement, known as heqin, or harmonious kinship, whereby Han princesses were married to Xiongnu leaders, had brought only temporary reprieve. Silk and grain flowed out of China as part of these treaties, but the raids did not cease. Emperor Wu's solution was bold. Instead of relying on fragile appeasement, he envisioned a counterweight. Rumors reached his court that the Yuezhi, once crushed by the Xiongnu and driven from their ancestral lands, now lived far to the west, near the fertile Oxus Valley, in what is now Uzbekistan and Tajikistan. The emperor reasoned that these displaced people might still hold a grudge against the Xiongnu. If so, they might be persuaded into an alliance with the Han, striking the Xiongnu from another direction. It was a plan of grand strategy, an attempt to forge connections across vast distances for the sake of survival and strength. But this vision required more than a desire. It required a person, a messenger capable of carrying the emperor's will into unfamiliar lands. Zhang Qian was chosen. At the time, he was a young official in the Imperial Guard, known for his steadiness and reliability. His background in Hanzhong, a region of rugged mountains and flowing rivers, had perhaps prepared him with resilience and adaptability. When he accepted the mission, he stepped into a role that would carry him far beyond anything his contemporaries could have imagined. The task was deceptively simple in its wording: reach the Yuezhi and persuade them to ally with Han China against the Xiongnu. Yet the obstacles were immense. The route westward was controlled by the Xiongnu themselves. To pass through their territory meant risking capture at every turn. The journey spanned thousands of miles, crossing deserts where water was scarce, mountains where snow lingered even in summer, and oases where unfamiliar tongues filled the air. Few in the Han court had any real sense of what lay beyond the frontier. For many, the lands beyond were little more than blank spaces in their mental maps, filled with rumor and speculation. Emperor Wu, however, was willing to risk the unknown. His ambition was not confined to the West. He also expanded southward into Vietnam and eastward into the Korean peninsula. But the West held particular allure, for it was whispered that in those distant lands were horses unlike any the Chinese had ever seen. These heavenly horses, as later legends would call them, were said to run with extraordinary power, their flanks gleaming with sweat, their endurance unmatched. To possess such horses was to enhance both military capacity and imperial prestige. In the imagination of Emperor Wu, the pursuit of alliance and the pursuit of these animals merged into a single vision of strength. At court, the announcement of Zhang Qian's mission would have stirred both curiosity and apprehension. Courtiers in flowing robes of silk may have whispered about the dangers of Xiongnu lands, about the improbability of success, about the weight of expectations. Yet beneath the murmurs was also a sense of wonder. What lay beyond those desert horizons? What peoples and goods awaited discovery? The Han had long been inward-looking, but with Emperor Wu's vision, the empire began to tilt outward, toward the larger world. We might imagine Zhang Qian preparing for departure, assembling a small retinue, gathering gifts of silk and lacquerware to present to foreign rulers, carrying the emperor's seals and letters inscribed on bamboo slips. He would have said farewell to Chang'an, its markets noisy with traders, its walls enclosing the bustle of empire. Then, he and his companions would have ridden westward, toward the frontier outposts, where the cultivated fields ended and the open grasslands began. It was not merely a physical journey, but a symbolic one. To step beyond the frontier was to step into uncertainty, to embody the emperor's ambition in human form. For Zhang Qian, the mission must have felt both daunting and momentous. He carried not only the hope of alliance, but also the possibility of expanding the very horizons of Chinese knowledge. As we rest with this moment, the emperor's vision made flesh in the envoy's departure, we feel the stillness before the storm. Zhang Qian has not yet faced the trials that await him. The Xiongnu have not yet cast him into captivity. For now, the air is filled with possibility, with the sense that history itself is about to pivot. The emperor dreams of allies, of horses, of victory. Zhang Qian, mounted on his horse, sets forth into the unknown, carrying with him the fragile weight of an empire's hopes. As Zhang Qian rode westward from the heart of Han China, he carried with him the weight of an emperor's hope and the distant promise of alliance. Yet almost as soon as his journey began, he found himself ensnared in the very peril that had haunted the Han frontier for decades. The Xiongnu, vigilant and swift, captured Zhang Qian and his small party. Thus began a chapter of his life defined not by diplomacy or discovery, but by endurance. The Xiongnu were masters of the steppe, nomadic horsemen who lived in felt-covered yurts, moving with the seasons, and thriving in an environment that to sedentary farmers seemed inhospitable. Their herds of horses, sheep, and cattle sustained them, and their skill with the bow made them formidable adversaries. For centuries, these nomads had been the anxiety of agricultural empires, their mobility allowing them to raid, retreat, and evade pursuit. To the Han, they were both feared and despised, yet grudgingly respected for their resilience. For Zhang Qian, capture by the Xiongnu meant a sudden reversal of fortune. He had set out as an envoy, bearing gifts and imperial letters, yet now he was reduced to a prisoner, cut off from the lands he was meant to reach. According to historical accounts, Zhang Qian was held captive for more than a decade. During this time, he lived among the Xiongnu, learning their ways, observing their customs, and waiting for a chance to escape. We may imagine what those years were like. Each day began with the routines of nomadic life, herding animals, repairing tents, and moving camp according to the rhythms of pasture and water. Fires flickered under the open sky, the winds of the steppe carrying scents of smoke and grass. Zhang Qian was not permitted to return to China, nor to continue his mission. Instead, he lived under watch, his movements restricted, his role diminished from envoy to captive. Yet, he did not abandon hope. Historical records tell us that during this captivity, Zhang Qian took a Xiongnu wife, and together they had a child. This detail is striking, for it reveals how the lines between captive and participant blurred. He became, in a sense, part of the Xiongnu world, even as he remained loyal in spirit to the Han. It is possible to picture him sitting in a tent lit by oil lamps, his child sleeping nearby, his mind still turning toward the mission he had been given. The passage of time must have weighed heavily. Each year, another measure of delay. Each season, another reminder of distance from his emperor's command. And yet, captivity was not without its lessons. Living among the Xiongnu gave Zhang Qian insight into their strengths and weaknesses, their patterns of movement, their social structure, and their reliance on herds. When he later returned to Han China, his knowledge of their ways proved valuable to military planners. What had been intended as a setback became, in hindsight, a kind of education, gained through endurance rather than choice. After more than 10 years, Zhang Qian saw his chance. With his wife and child, he slipped away from the Xiongnu encampment. The details of his escape are hazy in the sources, but the image of a man seizing freedom after a decade of restraint is powerful. To walk or ride into the open steppe with no certainty of survival, yet with determination unbroken, is itself a testament to his character. The psychological toll of captivity cannot be overstated. To be bound by others' will for so long, to watch time pass while one's mission remains unfulfilled, could have crushed many. Yet Zhang Qian's endurance suggests a deep loyalty to the emperor's vision, and perhaps also a resilience rooted in the human capacity to adapt without surrendering hope. Even as he lived among the Xiongnu, he remained, in his heart, an envoy of Han China. When at last he reached beyond the Xiongnu's grasp, Zhang Qian resumed his mission as if the years had not broken its purpose. Though older, perhaps weathered by hardship, he carried forward, still intent on reaching the Yuezhi. His persistence transformed what might have been the end of a story into a remarkable continuation. As we pause at this point in his journey, let us imagine Zhang Qian standing on the edge of the steppe, the sky vast and unbroken above him. Behind him lay years of captivity, woven with both loss and learning. Before him stretched the uncertain path to Central Asia. His companions, fewer now, yet loyal, looked to him for guidance. He carried not only the hope of the emperor, but also the quiet strength earned through survival. In the stillness of this moment, we sense how history is often made not in swift victories, but in the slow endurance of those who refuse to let go of purpose. Zhang Qian's years among the Xiongnu remind us that even in confinement, knowledge can grow. Even in delay, resilience can ripen. And as he turns his face westward once more, the great arc of the Silk Road's beginnings continues to unfold. After years of captivity, Zhang Qian at last gained his freedom, slipping from the watch of the Xiongnu and turning again toward the west. His escape was not only a release from confinement, but a renewal of purpose. Though older and marked by years of delay, he still carried with him the mission entrusted by Emperor Wu. The lands he sought were far beyond the borders of China, stretching into Central Asia across deserts and mountains that seemed endless to those accustomed to the fertile valleys of the Han. We may picture Zhang Qian's small party moving cautiously through the vastness of the steppe, wary of Xiongnu patrols, but driven onward by determination. Ahead lay the unknown, a world spoken of in rumors at the Han court, lands of great horses, of fertile valleys, of peoples whose names were strange to Chinese ears. Behind lay captivity, a chapter he was eager to close, though its lessons stayed with him. The journey beyond the frontier was formidable. The geography of Central Asia is unforgiving. The Taklamakan Desert stretches in wide, arid expanses, while mountain ranges such as the Pamirs and the Tian Shan rear up like barriers against travelers. Water is scarce, sandstorms unpredictable, and the distance between oases can be measured not in miles, but in days of exhaustion. To cross such terrain demanded resourcefulness and resilience. Zhang Qian and his companions would have relied on whatever guides they could find, perhaps local traders familiar with the routes between settlements. As they traveled, Zhang Qian encountered peoples who lived very different lives from those of the Han. Some dwelled in oasis towns, where irrigation made fertile small plots of land. Others roamed as pastoralists, moving herds of sheep and horses across the grasslands. The languages spoken were diverse, and customs unfamiliar. Yet for an envoy, observation was as important as diplomacy. Zhang Qian noted these details, carrying them in memory as information to be shared when he returned to China. One of the most striking regions Zhang Qian is believed to have reached was the Fergana Valley, located in modern-day Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan. It was here that the famed heavenly horses were bred, animals of extraordinary stamina and size, prized for their ability to endure long journeys and perform in battle. These horses fascinated Zhang Qian, for he knew their value to Emperor Wu's ambitions. In Chinese chronicles, they were described with admiration, their sweat likened to blood, their power seen as a gift from heaven. For Zhang Qian, encountering them confirmed that beyond China's borders lay resources of immense strategic importance. Beyond the Fergana Valley, Zhang Qian pressed onward to the Oxus River region, where the Yuezhi had resettled after their displacement by the Xiongnu. The Oxus, known today as the Amu Darya, flows through Central Asia into what was once the Aral Sea. Its valley was fertile, supporting agriculture and towns, and it lay at a crossroads of cultural exchange. For Zhang Qian, reaching this place was the culmination of his mission's outward journey. The peoples he met here lived differently from both the nomadic Xiongnu and the settled Chinese. Their dress, food, and customs bore the imprint of Central Asian traditions, a blend of influences from East and West. Merchants carried goods from India, Persia, and beyond, suggesting that even before the formal Silk Road existed, trade networks already connected distant worlds. To Zhang Qian, these discoveries were revelations. The world was larger, richer, and more interconnected than many in China had imagined. The psychological dimension of this stage of the journey is worth reflecting upon. Imagine the sensation of stepping into lands no one from your homeland has ever described, hearing voices in unfamiliar tongues, and seeing animals, crops, and goods unknown to your people. For Zhang Qian, each step westward expanded the boundaries of the imaginable. His mission, while diplomatic at its core, became also an act of exploration. Yet despite the awe these discoveries inspired, Zhang Qian never lost sight of his purpose. He was not a traveler for curiosity alone. He was an envoy, charged with persuading the Yuezhi to ally with the Han against their common enemy. His arrival among them would soon test whether years of hardship and miles of travel could achieve the emperor's vision. As we drift with Zhang Qian across deserts and into fertile valleys, we see not only the landscape, but also the growing threads of connection. Threads that would, in time, be woven into the great fabric of the Silk Road. His escape from captivity had given him back his mission. His journey into the West was giving China a first glimpse of a wider world. Each step into foreign lands was a step into history itself, shaping the horizons of an empire and sowing the seeds of centuries of exchange. At last, after years of hardship and delay, Zhang Qian reached the Yuezhi in their new homeland near the Oxus River. His arrival was not simply a personal triumph after captivity and endless miles of travel. It was the moment when the purpose of his mission would be tested. Would the Yuezhi, long ago displaced by the Xiongnu, still harbor the will for vengeance? Would they join with Han China to strike at their old enemies and so fulfill Emperor Wu's vision of a grand alliance? The Yuezhi themselves were a people in transition. Once pastoral nomads of the Gansu corridor in northwestern China, they had been driven westward in a great migration after their defeat by the Xiongnu in the 3rd century BCE. By the time Zhang Qian encountered them, they had settled in the fertile valleys of Central Asia, particularly around the Oxus. Here, they enjoyed land suitable for farming, access to rivers, and proximity to trade routes that connected them with Indian, Persian, and Hellenistic worlds. What had been a displaced, wounded people now prospered in new surroundings. Zhang Qian, as envoy, would have presented himself formally, bearing gifts of silk and lacquerware, and delivering Emperor Wu's message. He described the strength of the Han Empire, its desire for alliance, and the potential to defeat the Xiongnu together. His words would have been carefully chosen, carried with the dignity of the court, and delivered with the gravity of one who had endured much for the sake of this moment. Yet the response of the Yuezhi was not what he or his emperor had hoped for. They listened politely, but they had no appetite for war. Their old enmity with the Xiongnu, though not forgotten, had been dulled by time and prosperity. Having found fertile lands and new opportunities, the Yuezhi were content to build their lives in Central Asia. For them, stability and prosperity mattered more than vengeance. To risk all in a campaign against the Xiongnu was to risk losing the security they had finally secured. For Zhang Qian, this refusal was no doubt a disappointment. The alliance that Emperor Wu imagined could not be forged. The dream of striking the Xiongnu from two sides dissolved in the pragmatism of the Yuezhi. Yet even in failure, Zhang Qian had succeeded in something profound. He had made contact with a people far beyond China's borders, and in doing so, he had brought back knowledge that would change the Han Empire's understanding of the world. During his time among the Yuezhi and their neighbors, Zhang Qian observed carefully. He noted the goods that passed through the region: jade, lapis lazuli, horses, and textiles from distant lands. He saw evidence of India's influence to the south, of Persia's traditions to the west, and of remnants of Hellenistic culture left in the wake of Alexander the Great's conquests. The world he described was one of rich diversity, a crossroads where civilizations met and mingled. For China, accustomed to thinking of itself as the center of civilization, these revelations were both surprising and illuminating. The failure of his mission in narrow terms, no alliance, no joint campaign, must have weighed heavily on Zhang Qian. Yet, in the quiet moments, perhaps under the night sky of Central Asia, he may have recognized the significance of what he had seen. Even if the Yuezhi would not march against the Xiongnu, their lands and their trade revealed possibilities of another kind. The possibility of exchange, of contact, of a network stretching far beyond what most in Han China had imagined. This stage of the story carries with it a lesson about the unpredictability of history. Missions may fail in their stated objectives, yet succeed in ways unplanned. Zhang Qian did not return with an ally, but he returned with knowledge that Emperor Wu would find invaluable, and that would plant the seeds for centuries of exchange. As we rest on this chapter, let us picture Zhang Qian among the Yuezhi, standing in a land of fertile fields and flowing rivers, hearing languages unfamiliar, watching caravans move along tracks that led to worlds beyond his imagination. His words could not persuade them to fight, but his eyes could not fail to see the breadth of the world. What he carried back was not victory, but vision. When Zhang Qian at last turned eastward, the road before him was no less perilous than the road he had already traveled. His mission to the Yuezhi had ended without the alliance Emperor Wu desired, yet he carried with him something equally valuable, a treasury of observations. What he had seen of peoples, goods, animals, and lands was new to China, and his responsibility was to bring this knowledge back to the emperor's court. The return journey was long and fraught with danger. Again, Zhang Qian and his companions risked encounters with the Xiongnu. Indeed, accounts suggest that he was captured a second time before finally reaching the safety of Han territory. It is difficult to imagine the discouragement that might have settled over him in those moments, having endured more than a decade in captivity already, now again at the mercy of the same formidable enemy. Yet, as before, Zhang Qian endured. Whether by resilience, luck, or a blend of both, he found his way home. A survivor who had carried his mission through to its end. When Zhang Qian re-entered the capital of Chang'an, he must have looked very different from the man who had departed years earlier. His clothes were worn by long travel, his body lean from hardship, his face marked by sun and wind. But he returned not empty-handed, for the scrolls of his memory were rich with detail. Before the emperor and the assembled court, he recounted all that he had seen. He spoke of the Yuezhi, their fertile lands, their reluctance to fight the Xiongnu. He described the peoples of Dayuan in the Fergana Valley, whose heavenly horses had astonished him. He reported on the great region of Bactria, influenced by the legacy of Alexander the Great, where Greek-speaking communities still lived and where agriculture flourished beside rivers. He spoke, too, of India, its great cities and elephants, its trade goods and customs. He even described lands farther west, hinting at great kingdoms that lay beyond. For the Han court, these accounts were extraordinary. China's mental map of the world expanded dramatically, filled now with detail and possibility. The court scribes and officials recorded Zhang Qian's words, weaving them into the fabric of Han historical chronicles. What emerged was a picture of a connected world, where goods and ideas already moved across continents. Though the Han had previously thought of themselves as isolated at the center of civilization, Zhang Qian's reports suggested otherwise. Beyond the deserts and mountains, there were lands as rich and powerful as their own, linked by roots of trade and diplomacy. Emperor Wu, though disappointed by the failure to secure an alliance, was deeply impressed by the wealth of knowledge Zhang Qian had brought. The emperor's imagination was stirred by tales of the blood-sweating horses, so superior to China's breeds. He recognized their military value and soon sought to obtain them for his cavalry. Campaigns into the Fergana Valley would follow, in pursuit not only of horses, but of influence and prestige. Zhang Qian also reported on the crops he encountered. Alfalfa, for example, used to feed horses, and grapes, which would later be cultivated in China for winemaking. These details may seem small, yet they reveal how his journey began to alter daily life in the Han Empire. Knowledge flowed not only into military and diplomatic strategies, but also into the rhythms of agriculture, diet, and trade. The emperor rewarded Zhang Qian despite the technical failure of his mission. He was promoted, honored for his endurance and for the invaluable intelligence he provided. In this recognition, we see the Han court's wisdom in valuing knowledge as much as conquest. Though the alliance had not been secured, Zhang Qian had opened a window to the wider world, and through it, the first glimmers of the Silk Road appeared. As we imagine this moment, we picture the great hall of the Han court, its pillars painted in vermilion, its courtiers listening intently as Zhang Qian described distant lands. The emperor sits upon his throne, hearing of horses that gleam in the sun, of valleys fertile beyond measure, of people who speak in foreign tongues. The court is hushed, aware that the world they thought they knew has just expanded. The return of Zhang Qian, therefore, was not the end of a failed mission, but the beginning of a larger vision. His endurance transformed disappointment into discovery, captivity into insight, and hardship into history. He stood not only as a loyal envoy, but as the first Chinese diplomat to push so far beyond familiar horizons. As this chapter closes, we feel the shift, from a mission of narrow diplomacy to a vision of expansive connection. Zhang Qian has returned to China, his words unfolding before the emperor like a map newly drawn. Soon, the empire will act on these revelations, and the threads of trade will begin to weave more firmly into the fabric of history. From the moment Zhang Qian stood before Emperor Wu and recounted the breadth of his experiences, the idea of a wider world began to settle into the Han imagination. Though his mission had not secured the alliance the emperor sought, it had awakened something greater: the awareness that China was not alone in its strength, nor in its resources. Beyond the deserts and mountains, there existed lands whose goods, animals, and ideas could enrich the empire. It was from this awareness that the earliest stirrings of what would later be called the Silk Road began to emerge. At first, these stirrings were tentative, more like shoots pushing through soil than the robust networks that would eventually span continents. The Han were cautious, but they were also intrigued. Zhang Qian's reports of Dayuan and its heavenly horses had captured the emperor's imagination. Horses were more than animals of burden. They were instruments of warfare, status, and pride. The Han cavalry, often at a disadvantage against the swift Xiongnu riders, could gain a new edge with these powerful steeds. Thus, expeditions were launched to acquire them, marking the beginnings of intentional trade and exchange with distant regions. But it was not only horses. Zhang Qian had observed crops unknown in China. Grapes and alfalfa were among the most notable. Grapes promised new flavors, new methods of cultivation, and even the possibility of winemaking, while alfalfa provided fodder that strengthened the very horses Emperor Wu coveted. The introduction of such crops illustrates how trade was not confined to luxury goods alone. It touched the practical rhythms of daily life, influencing what people grew, ate, and used. Silk, of course, was China's most celebrated product, long prized within the empire for its softness and luster. To peoples beyond China's borders, silk carried almost magical value. Its threads shimmered in the light, unlike anything they could produce. As silk began to move outward, it became not only a commodity, but a symbol, a representation of China itself. Traders carried it westward, where it was exchanged for horses, precious stones, glassware, and other goods. In return, new materials and ideas found their way eastward, slipping gradually into the fabric of Chinese society. The early exchanges were often facilitated by envoys and merchants, rather than large caravans. Small groups carried goods between oases, bartering and passing them along to the next settlement. In this way, objects traveled in stages, sometimes changing hands dozens of times before reaching their final destination. Each exchange carried with it not only goods but stories, rumors of distant lands, fragments of languages, glimpses of customs. Slowly, the knowledge of a wider world spread. It is important to remember that in this early phase, the Silk Road was not yet a road in the way we imagine today. It was a series of routes, branching and converging, stretching like a network of veins across the continent. Some paths threaded through the Taklamakan Desert, skirting its edges to reach the safety of oasis towns such as Dunhuang and Khotan. Others wound through the mountains, where snow-capped peaks towered above narrow passes. Together, these routes created a web of connection, fragile at first but destined to endure. The seeds of cultural exchange also began to take root. Alongside goods, there traveled music, stories, and religious ideas. Though Buddhism's great journey into China would come later, the pathways that would carry it were already being opened. Traders, envoys, and travelers shared not only material wealth, but also fragments of belief and philosophy. To the Han, this was still a faint horizon, yet one that Zhang Qian's mission had illuminated. In daily life, the effects of these early exchanges were subtle but significant. Farmers began to experiment with new crops. Nobles acquired foreign animals and objects that signified wealth and status. The emperor himself took pride in his horses, symbols of his power to reach beyond the confines of China. Over time, these changes accumulated, weaving themselves into the empire's identity. As we reflect on this stage, it is gentle but profound. What began as a failed diplomatic mission was quietly transforming into the beginnings of global exchange. Zhang Qian could not have foreseen the centuries of flourishing trade and cultural contact that would follow his steps, yet his endurance had set it in motion. He had shown that beyond the horizon lay a world of connection, a world in which China would not only send forth its silk, but also receive in return new goods, new ideas, and new ways of imagining itself. In the stillness of this moment, we picture the first silken threads being tied, threads of trade, threads of culture, threads of human curiosity. They do not yet form the great fabric of the Silk Road, but they glimmer in the dawn light, fragile yet resilient. Zhang Qian's story has become more than his own. It has become the story of China's first steps into a larger world. As decades passed after Zhang Qian's return, the small shoots of contact he had planted grew into enduring networks of exchange. These networks would come to be known centuries later as the Silk Road, though at the time they were not seen as a single road, but as a web of paths linking distant peoples and empires. What began with an envoy's journey evolved into a system of cultural and economic arteries that carried goods, ideas, and beliefs across half the world. The flourishing of these exchanges cannot be separated from the ambitions of the Han Dynasty. Emperor Wu, inspired by Zhang Qian's reports, pursued campaigns westward to secure access to the regions of Dayuan and beyond. The desire for the heavenly horses drove Han armies into the Fergana Valley, establishing both influence and precedent for further interaction. These campaigns were costly in lives and resources, yet they revealed the emperor's commitment to reaching outward, to making contact with lands whose wealth and animals could strengthen his empire. Merchants followed where soldiers had gone. Step by step, trade routes grew busier, dotted with caravans carrying bales of silk, pots of lacquerware, and fine ceramics from China. In return came glassware from the Mediterranean, precious stones such as lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, spices from India, and woolen goods from the western steppes. Each object told a story of distance traveled and hands exchanged, a story woven into the fabric of global history. Religion also found its pathways along these routes. In the centuries after Zhang Qian, Buddhism spread from India into Central Asia and eventually into China, carried by monks, pilgrims, and traders. Temples rose along the route, their walls painted with murals depicting both Indian and Central Asian artistic traditions. The caves at Dunhuang, carved into cliffs along the edge of the desert, became repositories of this exchange, filled with statues and scrolls that blended Chinese, Indian, and Persian influences. Ideas moved as subtly as objects. Musical instruments, such as the lute, traveled into China, changing the soundscape of court music. Knowledge of astronomy, medicine, and mathematics flowed in both directions. The Silk Road became not only a conduit for material wealth, but also a classroom without walls, where cultures learned from one another across vast distances. The landscapes of the Silk Road shaped the rhythm of these exchanges. Travelers passed through the harsh Taklamakan Desert, where dunes stretched endlessly, and only oases offered respite. In the Pamir and Tian Shan Mountains, they braved thin air and narrow passes. Caravans moved slowly, their camels laden with goods, their bells tinkling in the dry air. Nights were spent in caravanserais, inns built to shelter traders, where people of many tongues gathered around fires, exchanging not only goods, but also stories. For the Han, these exchanges meant that China became increasingly aware of its place in a broader world. Silk, once a domestic treasure, became a currency of diplomacy, offered as gifts to foreign rulers, and traded for horses, gems, and exotic objects. Grapes and alfalfa, first described by Zhang Qian, spread through Chinese fields, altering agriculture. Glass from the Mediterranean, strange and dazzling, appeared in Chinese households, treasured for its novelty. Yet the Silk Road was not a highway of constant motion. It was fragile, subject to the rise and fall of empires, the shifting of alliances, and the dangers of banditry. Droughts could close sections of the route. Wars could sever connections for decades. Still, the idea endured that across deserts and mountains, there existed a path of exchange, binding together peoples who otherwise might never meet. As we drift with the centuries, we see how Zhang Qian's mission became more than a footnote of diplomacy. It became a hinge in history, opening the doors to exchanges that enriched China and the wider world. Through silk and horses, through religion and art, through crops and knowledge, the Silk Road wove together civilizations that had once seemed worlds apart. Let us imagine, in this quiet reflection, the glow of lanterns at a desert oasis, where merchants from China, India, and Persia sit together beneath a star-filled sky. They speak in fragments, with gestures and borrowed words, yet they understand enough to trade, to laugh, to share food and drink. In such moments, the Silk Road was not only commerce, but communion, a gentle reminder that across distances, human beings have always sought connection. Zhang Qian's journeys belong to the distant past, yet his legacy endures as one of the great turning points in world history. He is remembered in Chinese chronicles as a loyal envoy, a man who endured captivity, hardship, and disappointment, yet who returned with knowledge that would change the course of his empire. His life, though bound to the reign of Emperor Wu, resonates across centuries as the beginning of something larger. The Silk Road, that great tapestry of exchange which linked the civilizations of East and West. In Han times, his story was already woven into the empire's memory. Court historians recorded the details of his mission, the capture by the Xiongnu, the long captivity, the escape, and his eventual return. They emphasized both his endurance and the breadth of his discoveries. Though his embassy to the Yuezhi failed in its immediate goal, the knowledge he provided about Central Asia and its peoples enriched the emperor's policies. His name was associated with loyalty, resilience, and the willingness to sacrifice personal comfort for the sake of duty. Over the centuries, Zhang Qian came to be honored not only as a diplomat, but also as an explorer. Later dynasties looked back on his journeys as the symbolic beginning of China's connection to the outside world. In poetry and art, he was depicted as the envoy who opened the doors to the West, the man who carried silk beyond the deserts and brought back grapes, alfalfa, and visions of heavenly horses. Temples and shrines were dedicated to him in some regions, honoring him as a figure who bridged the familiar with the unknown. His influence extended far beyond the borders of China. The Silk Road, which his reports helped to inspire, became the conduit through which Buddhism entered China from India. Along with silk and horses, the teachings of the Buddha traveled eastward, carried by monks and merchants along the same routes Zhang Qian had once described. Over time, these teachings reshaped Chinese philosophy, art, and daily life, blending with Confucian and Taoist traditions to form a uniquely Chinese form of Buddhism. Without Zhang Qian's pioneering steps, the pathways for this spiritual exchange might have opened much later, or in very different ways. The Silk Road also transformed economies. Chinese silk became prized in Rome, where it was seen as a luxury fit for senators and emperors. Glassware, carpets, and spices flowed back toward China, adding texture to the empire's material culture. These exchanges were not always even or smooth, and they were often disrupted by war or collapse. Yet the idea persisted that China and distant lands were connected through exchange, and that Zhang Qian had been the one to reveal this possibility. His legacy is not only about goods, but also about imagination. Before Zhang Qian, China's vision of the world was bounded by deserts and mountains, the limits of familiar geography. After him, that vision expanded. The empire came to understand itself as part of a greater whole, one thread in a fabric that stretched across Eurasia. In this sense, Zhang Qian did not simply carry silk or messages. He carried perspective, a widening of the mind that would echo across centuries. In modern times, his name continues to be remembered. In China, monuments honor him as the pioneer of the Silk Road. His story is retold in history books, museums, and cultural projects that celebrate the connections between East and West. Archaeological discoveries along Silk Road routes, from murals in Dunhuang to artifacts in Central Asia, stand as living testimony to the exchanges he helped set in motion. Even beyond China, historians recognize him as one of the world's great explorers, a figure who endured hardship not for conquest or wealth, but for knowledge and connection. To think of Zhang Qian is to think of endurance. A man sent into captivity for years did not abandon his mission. Instead, he carried it forward, transforming disappointment into discovery. His persistence reminds us that history is often shaped not by swift victories, but by long patience, by the willingness to keep walking across deserts even when the outcome is uncertain. His story is one of resilience and vision, and of the quiet power of human curiosity. As we bring this journey to a close, let us rest with the image of Zhang Qian standing at the edge of the empire, gazing westward. Behind him lies the heartland of Han China, with its rice paddies, markets, and bustling capital. Before him lies the open steppe, the desert, the mountains, and beyond them, lands filled with horses, grapes, and ideas. He cannot know the centuries that will follow, the caravans that will carry silk to Rome, the pilgrims who will carry sutras to China, the music that will blend across cultures. He knows only that he has endured, that he has seen, and that he has returned with knowledge. Tonight, as we let the rhythm of history lull us toward rest, we can imagine the Silk Road not only as a path of trade, but as a path of understanding. Zhang Qian, the envoy, showed that even in hardship, discovery is possible, and that the courage to cross the unknown can leave echoes across millennia. His footsteps still resound along the sands of Central Asia, gentle reminders that curiosity and endurance are among humanity's oldest companions.